As a corporate attorney who's trained in M&A and emerging companies and venture capital, I understand the financing ecosystem, and I can help you close deals. I think what brought me to Baker Botts, it was not just the opportunity to go and practice law again, but to expressly do industry investment warfare. It's not just closing a Series A, which I've done dozens in the past. It's interesting and it's important and it changed lives, but it's also understanding what's happening at the forward line of troops in Donetsk, or what might happen in the South China Sea if the balloon goes up between the United States Navy and the People's Liberation Army.
Yeah.
So.
Welcome to Austinpreneur, our show about the stories that made Austin, Texas a global hub for startups. The show is produced by Capital Factory and hosted by me, Nick Spiller. As a reminder, by joining Capital Factory, you can plug into the ecosystem where the stories on this show were set. Learn more about us at capitalfactory.com. Welcome back, everyone, to the Austinpreneur podcast. We're recording here live the last day of Fed Supernova 2025. I've got another very exciting, very special guest today with us, and I'm excited to introduce him and dive into the topic of financing the future force. And in particular, our guest played a role in establishing and forming the Office of Strategic Capital, and we'll learn about that as a resource for entrepreneurs, investors, and a lot of people in our community. But Eric Robinson is special counsel at Baker Botts. He's advising clients in defense, maritime, critical minerals sectors on federal credit programs and financial support. He began his career as a U.S. Army officer in the 101st Airborne Division with deployments to Iraq, Afghanistan, later working at the National Counterterrorism Center and Joint Special Ops Command. He's former managing director and CEO of the Department of Defense's Office for Strategic Capital Credit Program Office in particular. So we'll kind of dive into the credit program side of it today. And yeah, he's done a lot of really interesting things within the DoD. He's also an Army spouse. His wife is in the Army, which is interesting. And went to Georgetown, Yale, and Syracuse. Some nice schools in the Northeast. So Eric, welcome to Austin.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. This is great. I appreciate it, Nick. And I welcome the opportunity to talk about segments of my career that are interesting. You've already laid out some of the history there, and I think as we go through the next hour, you're going to see how that there's connectivity between what's happening at the really like the forward line of troops, so to speak, in contemporary warfare, and what's happening in industry. And I've been fortunate to kind of accidentally fall into a career that gives me insight into the way soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines operate, how industry functions, and the way that the Pentagon and now multiple White Houses think about investment in the defense industrial base.
Right. Well, let's start at the beginning and with your time building the Office of Strategic Capital. Why did the Pentagon decide to launch a credit program for the industry? And tell us what we need to know about it.
Yeah, so the Office of Strategic Capital was announced at the Reagan Forum at the end of 2022. And in Secretary Austin's remarks, he sort of laid out a vision for the Pentagon, kind of establishing a hedge fund. They didn't call it that, but that's effectively what it was. And it wasn't hedging against commodity prices or fluctuations in equity prices. It was hedging against geopolitical catastrophe. And there was a recognition 2 years after COVID had first emerged in the United States that there were certain supply chains that were critical not just to the military, but to the entire commercial baseline in the United States that could be easily strained when there was this geopolitical uncertainty. That American investiture had led the United States to be the most wealthy country in the history of human civilization. And the American economy was a model of innovation and efficient capital allocation. But when events, both overseas or domestically, surprised policymakers or tested assumptions, that the economy was more brittle than anybody really cared to admit. the COVID experience, coupled with initial reflections of the expanded Ukrainian war for independence, gave policymakers at the White House and the Pentagon sort of a sense of alarm that the traditional ebb and flow of the American economy that is bracketed by tax policy, bracketed by direct procurement from the Department of Defense, but not particularly affected by direct government investment, was leaving opportunities on the table, opportunities for technological development, but also for building a more resilient, robust defense industrial base. And OSC was created first as almost like a test case anchored around the Secretary of Defense's office, but over the couple of years that I was there, built into a formal component of the Department of Defense, a established segment of the Pentagon's order of battle, to start shifting capital markets in a way that was going to be advantageous, not just for shareholders, but taxpayers, and thinking of taxpayers, that was going to be both a respectful and responsible steward of taxpayer money, but it was also going to direct investment that served to advance strategic interest, not pure economic efficiency.
All right. And then can you give some examples of the critical supply chains that you were looking at when this stood up, and even what were
I think
important today?
Yeah, the baseline experience, I think, and this is an important segment of the OSC Foundation. And I wasn't there at the time. I was in the private sector. I was not a OSC founder. I was in like the first tranche of hires after the founders got some money, really, built up the team. But the experience with trying to source personal protective equipment in COVID, the process of trying to identify ventilators, that served as a form of strategic shock. Strategic shock is often witnessed in forms of historical moments like Pearl Harbor or the Egyptian crossing of the Suez on the 6th of October, 1973, where countries work under a set or a lattice work of assumptions that are then tested, and those assumptions prove to be exceptionally brittle. And the American healthcare system, while delivering miracle cures and extending lifespans and coming up with therapies to treat cancer or effectively cure AIDS, it was a safe assumption to always bet on behalf of American healthcare being able to discharge its responsibilities collectively. And it was this remarkable partnership between the private sector and government that enabled it to happen. And while there are efficiencies, it was still able to deliver. And then when supply chains were constrained, when travel was limited, when geopolitical circumstances shifted, the United States could not purchase the supplies that it needed to keep healthcare workers still facing people who are infected with this virus. And the Pentagon started employing a sort of an aged tool, the Defense Production Act, to use special spending authorities to gain access to critical medical materials. And one, I think there's recognition that, yes, the federal government can operate in private sector in a respectful and responsible way. Two, the supply chains that were feeding into the United States for medical purposes were international, were brittle, and were often subject to the ownership and influence of countries that didn't necessarily share the United States' strategic interest. And three, crisis response took time, and that moving, so to speak, to right of boom after the crisis has happened was going to be insufficient to the scope of the task, that the United States needed to start setting conditions for a more resilient economy before another crisis erupted. So with the COVID-19 case study, and to an extent, the experience of arming the Ukrainian resistance against the expanded Russian invasion, there was a sensibility that the United States needed to start being much more aggressive in critical supply chains, both for the Department of Defense, but also for not just healthcare, but more broadly. Anecdotally, I think people at the Pentagon recognized that semiconductor shortages were affecting auto sales, and auto sales were feeding into inflation in 2022 and 2023. So there was a cascading effect that even in the grand scope of human history, COVID-19 was catastrophic for the people who suffered, but it was kind of a minor development compared to a conflagration between the People's Republic of China and the United States. So OSC was part of an architecture of condition setting. So if there was a full-on war between these parties, that the American economy would be better suited to endure.
So it really kicked off with this people in all walks of life in a lot of different ways, like really had a real world test when the pandemic hit. And, we really, society stopped, the economy stopped in a lot of ways that we've never experienced, at least, I haven't. And that was a key piece, and particularly the healthcare supply chain. And then it sounds like, like working through the ventilators, PPE, that was the first test. Was that what caused OSC to get started, or was OSC already set up in the middle of that? And actually, did you provide any financial support to those supply chains, or is more like a reason it started?
The crisis action group that came together internally to the Pentagon to help around the Defense Production Act, I think recognized, one, that the American economy is more brittle than anyone had really expected. Two, geopolitical crisis can take something that's brittle and turn it into something that is shattered. But three, there's also a kind of a theory of the case that the United States, through dedicated federal spending, can shift capital markets. It can shift private sector behavior. It can set incentive structures that are different than the way that private capital traditionally allocates funding to investment targets. But it was COVID, it was the Ukraine war, and then it was traditional intelligence forecasting, that if you can use those examples as rehearsals for the future, if you can put yourself into the mindset of how ugly it can be if, let's say, trans-Pacific shipping gets curtailed because there's like unrestricted submarine warfare, then you can template what the impact that it has on the United States or allies and partners, the entire global economy. So all of this was caged under the sensibility and the downstream effect of like the 2018 National Defense Strategy that reoriented American defense priorities away from the 2-decade experience of the global war on terrorism towards this moment of great power competition and then the big four threats against which the United States was going to orient.
And now I think there's a lot of other supply chains. We're talking about semiconductors, other even the supply chain of the moon.
Right. And I'm glad that you mentioned semiconductors, because the Department of Defense wasn't acting alone. That there was, using the term whole of government approach is often a cliche. You got to be really careful with it. But the COVID experience didn't just inform the Pentagon, and they didn't just tap 5 or 6 people to start tinkering around defense spending. The 2022 CHIPS and Science Act was a landmark shift in the way that the federal government was interacting with the private sector. And federal credit as a spending tool isn't new. There's, by the end of 2024, I think it was a $4 trillion balance sheet that came through a variety of different forms of spending. Ag loans, federal housing, student loans. There's a vast array of federal funding out there. But actually doing direct loans in the interest of encouraging reshoring of manufacturing supply chains was a break from the past. That it was something that the first Trump administration never really considered, the Obama administration didn't touch, but the Biden administration, in a bipartisan act of Congress, decided to start putting, depends on how you count, like $68 billion towards restoring semiconductor manufacturing in the United States. And that was a predecessor to OSC, and it was coupled with efforts that existed at the Department of Energy, their loans programs office, a couple of infrastructure programs at Army Corps of Engineers and the Environmental Protection Agency. But there was a collective sense in 2022, 2023 that, one, there's a geopolitical crisis potential, principally around U.S.-China conflict, and that the United States, both Congress and the White House, was leaving tools on the table that could be employed to set more favorable economic conditions for warfare in the mid-21st century.
Hmm.
So by the time that OSC was announced in 2022, it was organized around a couple of, like a partnership with the Small Business Administration that didn't require new legislation, a narrow band of spending that the Pentagon authorized OSC to discharge. But from 2022 to 2024 in March, when OSC received both authorization and appropriation to launch a federal credit program, that was really the inflection point when the Office of Strategic Capital gained a tool that could shift capital markets favorably for the strategic balance.
And you said the vision in the beginning, back in 2022 at the Reagan Forum, was a hedge fund. I mean, what did it end up looking like? Tell us more about the structure and the type of financings you could expect from OSC.
Yeah, and I think at the end of 2022, there was it was an opportunity for OSC to determine which tools were available and how best to employ those tools. So the first program was partnering with the Small Business Administration to direct SBIC, Small Business Investment Company funding, towards Department of Defense technology objectives. And that program is still enduring, but it's fundamentally an SBA program with like a DoD wrapper on it.
Yep.
And there's a couple of other somewhat minor in terms of dollar amount programs that OSC discharged. Just this past week, Expo was announced as a recipient of a grant. I think it's $13.6 million through an OSC Department of the Army program to build.
We just had Jason Crossbow on the deal.
Yeah, did I say Expo or did I say Crossbow? How do they say it out loud? I've read it a dozen times.
Crossbow. It's not fully known. That's why you should listen to podcasts. You can hear how to spell all these terrible stuff.
No, it's one of these. It's a great point because I am first and foremost like a literary person. Like I read everything, but then I recognize that I am disarmed to pronounce stuff sometimes because I've never heard it said.
Yeah, and that's why it's important to come to big conferences like that. And
That's right.
And have these real life conversations.
Yeah, get to shift your pronunciation a little bit.
That's right. I've been working on it. I'm in the zone. I've had like 5 of these yesterday. So.
Okay. Well, I'm on my 5th cup of coffee, so I'll catch up.
That's a big. That counts as like 3 cups of coffee. Right?
But to get back to it, there were enduring conversations around OSC being more like a traditional hedge fund, like granting this institution the ability to buy stock in startups. And that is still pending. And I think by the time we wrap up, we can talk about the OSC of the future. But that would have been a substantial departure. The federal government historically does not take equity slugs from private industry. That there's typically speaking, it's always an exception, like Troubled Assets Recovery Program, TARP, the Airline Support Program post-COVID. The Department of the Treasury sometimes takes short-term membership unit interest in LLCs or stock warrants in like crisis scenarios. But you don't often see like the Department of Defense leading a Series A round.
But we're seeing more.
Yeah.
In particular, the MP materials deal happens.
Yeah, and I think that's an important case study to get to. But before I hit that, the OSC started getting, by virtue of studying the market, hiring people that understand the federal tools that were available. And rather than designing a brand new tool for OSC to employ, they adopted a federal credit program. And federal credit programs are common. There's hundreds of them. Most people, unless you are like a lobbyist, you don't necessarily pay that much attention to them. But it is a standard tool of like federal spending policy. Right. But arming the Pentagon with one that was expressly commercially oriented was different. That if you live in military housing, you're often the recipient of something called the Military Housing Privatization Initiative, which is a Clinton-era federal credit program that was designed to refurbish military housing. There are other, I don't want to call them covert or clandestine, there are other smaller credit programs at the Department of Defense. But what made OSC interesting in a fundamental way, it was one that was entered into the order of battle by statute. 10 U.S.C. 149 no longer makes this just like the Secretary of Defense's priority. It's no longer some goofy tiger team. It is a segment of the Department of Defense that's written into law. But they also got express authorization, and then Congress appropriated funding to launch a federal credit program with the express mission of providing direct loans, loan guarantees, and project support money called technical assistance to private sector actors that were not the defense primes, but were companies that supported the defense primes or were just operating in interesting ways in the American economy with the intent of, going back to this original theme, building improved resilience in the American defense industrial base. So OSC was not going to just float a loan to Lockheed Martin to make F-35s a little more efficiently. It was going to go to metal shops. It was going to go to tool and die makers, to rare earth mineral providers, to specialty magnet designers, to company
industry.
That's exactly right. That if you are a specialty gas provider and you are putting up towers in like Greater Austin, Texas, you are part of the defense industrial base because you are now eligible to support the covered technology categories that the Pentagon was instructed by Congress to invest in. So there's an extraordinary breadth of American investment opportunity around this program. And at first it was humble. When I was helping the program go through its regulatory establishment, which is effectively negotiating with the Office of Management and Budget to your risk management processes, your projects development, your underwriting standards, basically getting approval from your regulators to operate. This was only a $984 million program. It was interesting, but from an academic perspective, but people in capital markets really didn't have to care all that much because $900 million doesn't, it just doesn't
whole needle on the market. Yeah.
But with the confidence building measure that I think we were part of back in 2024 in negotiating with OMB, with making formal declarations to Congress, the powers that be recognized that this set of responsibilities could be discharged effectively and ethically. And from that moment in early 2024 up to the 4th of July of this year, that $984 million spending authority is now $200 billion. And that's real money. Like that is a fundamental shift. And now the Pentagon is exercising that authority.
I'll take just one billion.
And are you operating in a covered technology here?
I could probably find a few. There's a few hanging around here.
No.
Yeah.
Intentional genius, part of it is, why Baker Botts hired me to help companies navigate this, is that the executive branch alone can sort of determine a scope of priorities. You can say, this is important to me, this isn't important, I'm going to invest my attention in this, I'm going to hire talent against this problem set, or I'm going to ignore that problem set. The executive branch, through executive orders, has a substantial amount of sort of authoritative leeway. What is distinct about this program is that it is housed at the Department of Defense. It reports to the Secretary of Defense, but it is Congress saying, okay, we're giving you this extraordinary checkbook, and this is what you're investing in. Mm-hmm. Right now, it's 33 so-called covered technology categories. And if you pay attention to the way that the federal government organizes technology investment, there is no standard system that you have to follow a variety of different lists. But for example, if you are a company operating in the supply chain for quantum sensing, you are eligible. And what is quantum sensing? It's an advanced form of sensor to shooter architecture that's based around quantum computing hardware. But you don't necessarily have to be building the quantum computer itself to be eligible for this kind of funding. You can be building the data center for it. You can be building the facilities. You can be doing cooling for the computers. You can be doing the power sourcing. That's the advantage here, that Congress didn't just give the Pentagon a series of NAICS codes and said, okay, this is what you're investing in. It gave thematic technology targets that are going to be important for the United States in 2040, 2050. And it's up to the Department of Defense to sort of self-regulate the approach to that. So one of OSC's, I don't want to call it a secret weapon because it's written in statute, it's in 10 USC 149, is that it has this extraordinary amount of spending authority, but it also can be creative. And it can come up with novel direct loan opportunities for companies operating in a pretty wide array of segments of American and international industry.
And you mentioned talking about the future of the OSC. You've got, well capitalized with 200 billion. There's the 33 cover technology categories that I'm sure we can Google and find on the website somewhere. Or,
Yeah, 10 USC 149, subsection F2. And it's just a list, and it doesn't elaborate. Again, this is kind of an advantage that OSC has, is that if you look at the regulatory definition in statute and in guidebooks that like OMB promulgates, if you look at the definition of infrastructure, you can tell a lawyer wrote it because it's like 6 straight sentences of dense text. And it's all very interesting, but it's designed to provide a rule book to say, okay, you're infrastructure and you have this set of rules that are attached. You're not infrastructure, so you get to escape. The way that the cover technology categories are described is they're not even sentences.
Yeah.
And that provides the team at OSC the flexibility to identify sort of like I mentioned, especially gas providers or people who are doing unique cooling systems or battery systems or power generation or power storage, that if they are in the architecture of these cover technology categories and they're doing something authentically in support of it, they are eligible. That eligibility for this program is not this, like, to be perfectly honest, and this is something that I like about it, eligibility for OSC's funding is easier than SBIR. The trick is, and the complicated part, and what I do professionally, is taking you from eligible past viable to exceptional application. And that's like the secret sauce of our practice. Yeah, that's right. So that's a kind of a convoluted way of saying that the door is not just wide open, the door is wide, and maybe even the door is almost never shut. Yeah. But once you're in the room and once you're being considered, then there's a professional process of underwriting and assessing and counterintelligence screening and ensuring that you're effectively aligned, because what OSC is it's a commercially oriented credit program that these loans are supposed to recoup interests and principal back to the federal government. It's not a grant program. It is not a lender of last resort. Successful OSC partners are the kind of companies that can successfully borrow from just about anybody, but they like the style of debt. Like, it means something to their balance sheets. So it is on account of that disposition, and that is one, a policy decision, but two, also sort of bracketed by some arcane federal regulatory work. OSC has created this $200 billion solution for a certain sort of company. OSC is still not perfectly attuned to like pre-seed Series A companies. Right. Like, it's not ideal. There are ways it can approach that.
Like most forms of credit.
That's correct. That's exactly right. If you are in a venture process, if you're seed A, B, let's say you have limited revenues, you're still burning through cash on equity, like, what can the Office of Strategic Capital do for you? And the first answer is OSC's direct authorizations don't yet do much with startups. OSC's partnership with the Small Business Administration, however, does interact with startups. And it's sort of an indirect approach. So if you are a fund and you are licensed as a small business investment company, you can invest anywhere you want. And you have the imprimatur of the Department of Defense to do that. So if you are a private credit fund, if you are a venture fund and you want to become licensed as an SBIC, you can do that. And companies that are seeking capital can go to SBIC licensees, and the roster is published on the SBA website. You can seek capital from there. But something that we recognize is a gap in sort of from MRL level 1, 2 up through 7, or TRL 1 through 3 up the chain, is that if you are a startup right now, OSC doesn't have much that it can do for you. But Congress is working on it. And the MP materials deal has given us a template for what the future might look like. Because an important theme behind all of this is that federal credit tools are exceptionally robust. They can have massive amounts of cash infusions that go out to companies, but they are typically situated for more mature operators because they are assessed on typically speaking, on a cash flow basis. So you have to have booked in revenue that can be underwritten against. But Congress and the White House are starting to align around the idea of giving the Department of Defense additional equity authorities. And what equity authority means, if you're really interested, is probably not that much of a surprise. It's the ability of the Department of Defense to buy common stock, preferred stock, membership units, limited partner to become a LP in a fund, and just everything that's downstream from that. It has not entered into law yet. And the MP materials transaction, I think we should break into walk through that as a case study.
Yeah.
But both the Senate Armed Services Committee, and I think there's a markup of the House that are looking at multiple versions of either extending purchasing authority directly to the Office of Strategic Capital or enshrining the Defense Production Act team, which is in a different segment of the Pentagon at the Acquisition Sustainment, Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition Sustainment discharges that. So Congress is starting to recognize that there is a gap. One of the challenges with operating around equity from a federal government perspective is that direct lending is cheap to the taxpayer. That we say there's a $200 billion authority that you can spend, and that is true. But the way that federal accounting works is you are only treating a small segment of that, maybe 3.5%, 5% as your capital reserve. So the taxpayers book, let's say theoretically speaking, you're doing a $100 million loan. Taxpayers book $3.5 million of spending, but the actual impact in the American economy is $100 million. If you're doing equity spending, it's typically marked at a one-to-one basis. So there is no multiplier effect. That if the Office of Strategic Capital, let's say, leads a Series A for $25 million, you don't reserve 3.5% and you mark the rest. You've got to come in for the full slug of cash. So Congress is less comfortable with that because you don't have that built-in efficiency.
You're talking, from what I hear, is a whole new business model for the DoD and the government, and this grows and creates interest and cash flows. Like it could become a meaningful way to finance the DoD versus just tax dollars.
It's an interesting moment in American domestic and national security policy. Back in 2016 and 2017, I was working at the Joint Special Operations Command, and I was at JSOC as a policy advisor because the Obama administration had a very carefully constructed method for determining military operations against the Islamic State. And they had a rigid decision-making process with robust intelligence reviews, and the elements of the Department of Defense that were discharging this military campaign needed professionals to understand it. And the Trump campaign, then into the Trump administration, kind of just kept most of it in place. That there was two different administrations from Obama into Trump 1 that really had very little in common. And they kept the counterterrorism architecture effectively in place when everything else changed. And I saw thematic continuity on a narrow band of foreign policy just by virtue of where I was at the time. And I got to see it again between Biden and Trump too, that the idea of employing federal credit as a means of encouraging direct investment in the defense industrial base is a rare assumption that has endured between two administrations. So there was a substantial amount of chatter, I think often somewhat irresponsible, and people who weren't necessarily juiced with the Trump team, talking about canceling all of the loan programs office's loans or rolling back chips or shutting down OSC. And they've done none of it. There's different emphasis that the Department of Energy is probably going to do less than what the Office of Strategic Capital is going to do in the future. But there's this moment in American, we can call it defense industrial base policy or industrial policy, where there's a collective assumption of manufacturing has withered in the United States. Manufacturing is essential in time of crisis, and private capital alone doesn't have the incentive structure to respond effectively. So there has to be sort of the open, visible hand of government intervention that pairs with the invisible hand of private capital.
Fascinating.
And the MP materials deal, I think, is a good illustration of that. I don't want to interrupt any more questions, but it may be good to walk through some of that.
Yeah, I'm really curious because I think investing, taking equity, even the loans. It's fascinating, and just I'd love to hear more about it. But just to set the stage, while we were talking about it earlier, I asked ChatGPT how much I would have if I put $10 million into the Series A of Google today, right? And it was
Like if you're Shaquille O'Neal.
Shaquille O'Neal, or if you're the DoD, and that would result in, I think it was like $175 billion. And not to mention maybe some of the security aspects that would come along with that. So I think it's fascinating, especially, like when you're looking at, the fiscal situation at large of the country. Like, this is a really interesting way to finance things. So yeah, tell us more about NP Materials and perhaps even what's going on with Intel right now.
Yeah. So MP Materials happened, it was announced after I had left the Pentagon. I left, I think, like the last day of June of this year. And I had never heard of the transaction. That it was effectively, from my understanding, and some of this is based off of public filings that MP Materials has provided. There's press reporting out there. And some of it is just information I've gathered from a community of interest. But it was effectively pulled together by the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Ian Feinberg, and the team, that there's an acknowledgement that rare earth mineral extraction and processing is almost exclusively international, and that a substantial portion of the global markets for certain rare earths was taking place in either in the People's Republic of China or in locations that were susceptible to influence from other hostile actors. So MP Materials, a publicly traded company that had plans to restore some of this capacity domestically. And they, I think it was the 11th of July, they announced a fairly complicated transaction by and between the Department of Defense and this publicly traded company to restore some of this manufacturing domestically. And as soon as I saw the announcement, I talked with my colleagues who's back at OSC. I'm like, is OSC doing this? And and their reaction was broadly like, news to us, stand by, I'll tell you more once I hear about it. Yeah. But there's nothing illicit about that. It's completely within the realm of the set of responsibilities for the Deputy Secretary of Defense to solve these kind of challenges. But the deal is structured in an interesting way. There's a $400 million purchase of preferred stock from the Department of Defense. There's common stock and warrants that are also part of it. There are commercial offtake agreements, which is absolutely essential for federal lending, that the entire architecture of underwriting is based off of future projections of sales. Like, that's how you know that the loan is not going to go into default. And then there's a $150 million loan from the Office of Strategic Capital. So it was a substantial cash infusion at the time of closure, but also running into the future. And the disclosures that MP Materials provided to the SEC are really interesting. That they relied on Defense Production Act authorities and the concept of materials written into that statute, when warfighting materials could mean like subcomponents for explosives or batteries or fuses or something like that. The Department of Defense was comfortable using that concept of material to mean the common and preferred stock of a publicly traded company. That is aggressive lawyering, but it's successful. Like the counsel on the deal swore off on it. There's some fascinating disclosures in the transaction material about assurances that the Department of Defense provided back to the company. But in sum, what we're witnessing is another sort of landmark moment in industrial policy in the United States. Like, from the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act 2022, moving through the foundation of OSC, the establishment of a credit program within the Pentagon that was expressly commercialized, and then having the Pentagon fuse different authorities in an interesting way. One, historic production guarantees to make sure that this company has a customer running forward. Give it a price floor. Two, give it a loan to expand facilities. And three, give it a substantial equity purchase to give it the funding that it needs to operate. So the future, I assess, and this is obviously speculative, is going to look a little more like the MP materials deal, less like the sort of Chips and Science Act deals that went through upstate New York where I grew up, which have been looking for semiconductor manufacturing for 30 years, finally got it by virtue of this act. But those were traditional grants and loans, and now we're seeing, to your point, the Intel deal there being negotiated on the margins to maybe look a little closer to the MP materials transaction rather than some of the original agreements under CHIPS.
Yep. Was there anything else on OSC we want to make sure we should know before we start to land the plane here? Maybe if there's a question or two from the audience, we can tackle that.
Yeah, I think audience questions are good because the last point is OSC, and I think the team there recognizes this. We acknowledge it, that we did at the time. It does not have an opening right now. One of the more frequent questions I get from people who are interested in this is like, how do I apply? And they were instructed by Congress to employ a super formal process of what's called a notice of funding availability, where they publish a statement in the Federal Register, then you have to wait a period, then you open an application window. It is deliberate, it is open, it's accountable, it is ethical, it is dreadfully slow. They recognize that it is slow, but as a confidence building measure, they use this system. So OSC is looking at future investment targets at this time. I don't know whether or not that's going to be reflected in a new notice of funding availability or something more like a rolling application window that they open. But so that is to be determined. And like much of the Pentagon, OSC and its growth and its efficacy was has been affected by reductions in force, by hiring freezes. And if you look at other federal credit programs, they have hundreds of people, from attorneys to underwriters to engineers and tech professionals. OSC is like a 60-person team. Yeah. So part of the challenge and a thematic way to recognize this is that Congress gave this office an extraordinary amount of cash. They gave it a checkbook, and they said you can invest in almost anything you want, provided you can provide it and tie it back to national security imperatives. They just don't have a pen because they're still short of personnel. So it is fair-minded to say that OSC has been a little slow. Like, okay, we can accept that as a fair-minded observation, but it's been slow for reasons, and those reasons will fade.
And we could say the same thing about Army Futures here in Austin. It's turned out to be phenomenal and keeps the face of what.
The United States Army would never be slow.
Right, never. Getting faster here at Fed Supernova. Real quick, I mean, there was a institution that invested $10 million into Google at Stanford. Do you think there's a chance more universities start doing equity deals like this, or any?
It depends on how endowments are taxed. Yeah. I mean, universities, federal labs, FFRDCs, they have opportunities to monetize intellectual property that's developed on campus. Right. And certain campuses are much, much, much better than that. I mean, Stanford leads, MIT is good. Columbia has historically been very good around psychic cancer therapies.
Right. I don't know if there's too many more, to be honest.
Yeah.
My personal opinion, I can't speak for you.
Yeah. But the mission at the point of departure for OSC, it wasn't to just make this like a just federal check granting, because that's easy. It was designed to set financial conditions for private capital to follow. And that private capital can come from universities, it can come from family offices, it can come from investment funds that, provided you are aligned to the mission, you meet counterintelligence screens. Like, the idea is they're trying to set a table with as many seats as possible. And there are creative solutions that are underway in this architecture defense industrial base policy that are going to make this easier. In the 2025 National Defense Authorization Act, Congress created what's called the National Security Capital Forum. Congressman Pat Ryan from Hudson Valley, my wife's classmate at West Point, so we're close with his family, somewhat, as you can be with a member of the House. But he saw an opportunity to create a formal body within the federal government where federal spenders, like a credit program, or appropriators, grant makers, and professionals from the National Security Council or National Economic Council, the White House, elsewhere, could come together and could meet with investors, could meet with companies that require capital solutions, and work through a formal process of idea generation and solution identification. So I think yesterday at the opening comments for Fed or maybe it was even earlier in the week, like Joe Cosper came out and said, the objective here is serendipity, and that's excellent. People meet each other in their hallways, they can come up with solutions that would not otherwise exist. The National Security Capital Forum is designed to formalize that in a way that can dramatically accelerate the process of idea generation to problems, solution, and delivery. That one of the secret components of all of this is that the MP Materials deal, from what I understand, is that loan went from idea to closure in 45 days. That's the speed of business. Other federal credit programs, other loans taking 8, 9 months of plotting negotiation, I understand that is too slow to be interesting. But what the MP Materials deal, beyond the creative lawyering around it, demonstrated that these organizations can move very quickly. And with tools like the National Security Capital Forum organizing different actors who wouldn't normally be brought into the Department of Defense, you get, if I'm going to be an advocate for anything, it's the concept of a defense industrial base being much, much more broad. The Center for New American Security, Becca Wasser, who was over there, she just went over to Bloomberg, wrote a really excellent report on the defense industrial base a few months ago. And she used, just like good lawyering, narrowly defined defense industrial base. It's kind of like anchored around the primes, plus a couple of others like Pfizer, who sell substantially into the government. And she wrote about it using that definition. I think that was really helpful because it does show what the contemporary reflexive mindset about the defense industrial base is. When, for me, I like the theme around the National Security Capital Forum, where it's more of an opt-in environment, that you don't have to have a $70 billion market cap in order to be part of the DIB. You can be a tool and die manufacturer in Utica, New York, and you can be selling into Waterfleet Arsenal down Albany, and you're part of the team.
It's very fascinating. I mean, it seems like it's a whole new beginning. Assuming the support for this type of transactions continue, it feels like it could really make a huge difference in the ecosystem we're building here and across the country. I'm getting there. Yeah, what's your question?
So In-Q-Tel, from what I understand, was stood up to be sort of a VC hybrid to address those types of needs. It sounds like, and I know they're on the slower side. So what you're describing and sort of the future of potential, equity sharing, things like that with your office, could you compare and contrast? Like, is In-Q-Tel sort of like an old model, or is that something that could be taken and accelerated, or is that going to be a completely separate? Just kind of compare and contrast how that.
I mean, it's an extraordinarily common question. Like, one of the first two questions that OSC would get in basically any meeting is, who are you and what are you doing here? And as soon as you get pleasantries aside, like, how are you different from In-Q-Tel? And In-Q-Tel was covert, and now it's not, and it's run a nonprofit, and they stake innovative tech companies with equity capital. They do a lot of safe notes and stuff like that. If you're not familiar, like that's their basic model. They do exquisite research. They probably do more homework on a $250,000 seed check than anybody else in the environment, and there is real value there. Like, their analysis is extraordinary. They are operating at a segment of the ecosystem that is distinct from OSC. I also think that In-Q-Tel's model is going to be safe and is going to endure because of the accounting limitations that I mentioned earlier. And I acknowledge this is somewhat wonky and not particularly interesting, but Congress is going to be comfortable with federal credit programs because it's relatively inexpensive to fund. That, again, you can stake a $100 million loan with a $3.5 million capital reserve. That appeals to Congress in a different way than saying, if you want to do a $100 million Series C check, you need to stake $100 million against it. So my disposition towards In-Q-Tel is that they are safe from OSC.
Question kind of related to that, but I wanted to highlight something Glade sort of breezed over, and that's that In-Q-Tel is a 501c3. So like, it's chartered for the beneficial purpose of national security. Real weird thing. And so when that money is transferred to In-Q-Tel, like the stewardship, oversight, and kind of management responsibilities of the federal government go away, and that's a huge deal. So, were you in any talks with what the shape of that might look like as it relates to OSC, the kind of ongoing management and just our investment returns going into the treasury?
It literally just goes back to like, if you have to like pay your taxes, you like write a check to the United States Treasury. It just does that. It automatically accrues back to a treasury account. Like there are certain administrative fees that are assessed as part of certain federal lending. And this is a controversial and much more detailed component of the conversation, probably outside the scope of this today. But Congress carefully monitors the collection of administrative fees because they want to suppress the incentive for these funds or federal credit programs to pay themselves, and then they get to turn that money back and send it to grifter contractors or anything like that. And there are ways that these programs could be unethical. So Congress does pay a substantial amount of attention to that. But for basic accumulation of interest, it just goes right back to the Treasury.
Question.
Do we have time for one more?
Yeah, one more.
You were talking about the National Security Council and Capital Formed and how they can meet with investors for idea generation and solution. It sounds like that's where the tools are explored, the different types of financing tools. I was wondering, what is the process to get involved in that? Is it also through Congress, or is there another path?
It is statutorily formed. It is a extremely small team, and I'm not witting to the mechanism for petition to it yet. When I left the Department of Defense at the tail end of June, it had not started this process. And again, the reason that it is not up and functioning is mostly because of personnel limitations. But I do think like that on its own can be a strategically decisive mechanism. Some of these boards that the Pentagon convenes, like the Defense Innovation Board or like the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, are sometimes, they're like nice to haves that go to people in the last third of their career. And, they come to conferences in DC and they talk about their experiences. And I think the impact that they have is marginal on the best of days. And that's purely my assessment. I don't want that to reflect anybody else's, but I do think that the National Security Capital Forum has the potential of operating as a clearinghouse for good ideas. And I'm glad that it's already written into law, that it's not an idea that has to be sold. It's already there. It just has to be staffed appropriately.
Well, Eric, thank you. This is very interesting. I know
welcome.
I'm geeking out on it. It's I feel like deep in the weeds, but it's good stuff and feels like a big opportunity for companies. And I know you're recently moved out of OSC, working at Baker Botts. We're good partners here in Texas. Our team at Capital Factory can always help you connect with Baker Botts and everyone. I'm sure you're easy to connect with as well. But any particular way folks should reach out to you or learn more?
Yeah, the best way is to find me walking the halls, see me at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, New York, DC, wherever business takes me, or obviously go to the website. But as a corporate attorney who's trained in M&A and emerging companies and venture capital, I understand the financing ecosystem, and I can help you close deals. I think what brought me to Baker Botts, it was not just the opportunity to go and practice law again, but to expressly do industry investment in warfare. I just this week got to talk with founders. One was a Ukrainian who has developed a large language model based around the Dash 10 technical manuals for the Army's fleet of Humvees. And the Dash 10 and Dash 20 and Dash 30 technical manuals reflect different evaluation standards for baseline vehicles that the Army issues. That if you are a soldier and you are the driver for a vehicle, you do the Dash 10 maintenance. If you're a maintenier at a forward support company, you do the Dash 20. If you are at an Army depot, you do the Dash 30. And what this guy was able to do is take all of that text from 3 different open source manuals, combine it with evaluation that's available like on YouTube, like how do you fix a tire on a Humvee. He built it all into a walled garden LLM, built it in Ukrainian and English. So any soldier with any level of training can query it and get not just like a speculative answer from the internet. He can go to the actual manual and figure out what's wrong with their vehicle. And he's been able to test it in the field, in the war with Ukrainian forces. He's like, I've had trouble testing it with United States Army. So I'm like, well, my wife runs a Ford support company in her flight squadron. Like, maybe I can ask her to find some soldiers who want to run this and get to this person some feedback. And that's just one example of what I'm able to do at BakerBots. It's not just closing a Series A, which I've done dozens in the past. It's interesting and it's important and it changed lives, but it's also understanding what's happening at the forward line of troops in Donetsk, or what might happen in the South China Sea if the balloon goes up between the United States Navy and the People's Liberation Army.
Yeah.
So,
Well, Eric, thank you so much for
thank
coming
you
on the show and coming to Fed Supernova.
no, this has been great. I appreciate it. And thank you for the questions from the audience.
Great. Thanks for listening to this episode of Austinpreneur. Don't forget to check out capitalfactory.com to learn more about us and join our community. If you have thoughts about the show or ideas on how we can work together, reach out to me directly via email, nickspiller@capitalfactory.com. Shout out to the Capital Factory Dream Team for making this podcast possible, and special thanks to Aaron Handworker, who masterfully recorded and edited the show. Come back next week for a whole new episode.